Okay, hello everyone. Let me just see if I can try to get all these grey boxes a little bit away. Okay, hopefully this will improve the lecture recording experience for everyone, and everything will be a little bit clearer because, yeah, many of you know I've had some problems with the floating grey boxes in my Zoom screen, and it's been something perpetually facing me even during COVID lockdown, which I've never been able to fix for some reason. And I promise I'm quite good with technology, but just haven't worked it out. But hopefully it's a little bit better today. We'll see. But anyway, welcome to week 3. We're now in our last week of the theoretical component of our course, so the final week of part 1. And today it's all going to be about learning critical theories. So we've obviously already last week had a look at Marx in a reasonable amount of depth. And we're going to now see how some of Marx's, I guess, ideas or approaches has informed critical theory going forward in international political economy. So just to recap again, we've touched on in week 1 the classical political economists. We then went to Marx to hear the critique of political economy, and then we're going to pick up the threads again with international political economy and some critical theories of it. This is just going to be mostly a focus on critical international political economy theories. Other more conventional IPE theories will be discussed in subsequent weeks as they more relate to the history of the 20th century. And so I just want you to keep in mind that our discussion of theory is not totally finished as of yet. But I just wanted to have a week where we just specifically focus on these neglected theoretical frameworks in international political economy. And of course, these theories, just like all the other theories we've looked at so far, are incredibly extensive. And so we're only going to be really skimming the surface. But again, I'm hoping I'll give you enough detail where you learn plenty about them. It's engaging, and then hopefully you might be able to apply them in your assessment as well. So let me progress the slides. These are the learning objectives today, which you can see, which are also on the middle page. We have 3 required readings, which basically deal with each type of critical theory we're looking at today. And just a reminder, if you haven't already, please put your name down for leading one of the readings in an upcoming book club. Or if you're not able to for technological reasons, or you've maybe changed into a different tutorial, please feel free to contact me or even just talk to your tutor to arrange a time for you to read the book, lead the book club. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the history of IPE, or histories of IPE. So our discussion obviously last week ended with Marx, quite a while ago, and we're going to fast forward a little bit to the 1970s because, and I'll explain why in a moment, but a lot of really influential histories of international political economy have pointed to the 1970s as kind of being the birth of international political economy. And since the 1970s, at least, there's kind of been a division of scholars in international political economy between those who rely primarily on like empirical research questions in order to understand the dynamics of actors in the global political economy, and those who prepare to focus on like ontological inquiries into its historical evolution. And we'll talk a little bit more about that split into different schools. Now, quite famously, Benjamin Cohen in a 2008 book, which is I've put up as one of your recommended readings this week, which you can look at if you're interested. He quite famously, said that IPE was born just a few decades ago in the 1970s. And prior to the 1970s, in this English-speaking world, economics and political science were treated as entirely different disciplines, each with its own view of international affairs. So IPE for Cohen emerges, and Cohen's a very influential scholar, I believe an American scholar, but very influential. IPE for Cohen emerges as a recent attempt to merge economics with political science. Yet in order to kind of justify this image of IPE after 1970 as this unification, Cohen also does set the scene with a short prehistory of the field in his book. Now, this is a very brief look, and even in our course, we've probably done in more detail than included in Cohen's book. But Cohen presents a prehistory of IPE, which distances IPE from not only, critical and the classical political economy, but broader histories of international relations, and also marginalizes critical IPE in the process as well. All factors which are really important to understand where international political economy came from. So for Cohen, there's little or no IP before 1970s because of a late 19th century kind of split between economics and political science, a split that he argues was complete. So this is something that I know has been touched on in some tutorials where we were talking about, the classical political economists and the critical political economists, and this idea of the split or the spheres of politics and economics. This is something that we'll keep coming back to as a really important part of intellectual developments in trying to understand the capitalist world economy. And it's certainly going to be prominent when we look at neoliberalism as well. But for the purposes of this discussion, very influential histories of IPE, such as Cohen, has basically stipulated that before the 1970s, there was political science and there was economic science, and there wasn't any political economy, and that had faded away as these specializations started to be created. Now, there's been a lot of scholarship which has pointed out how wrong that theory of history was. And a lot of scholarship has noted the preponderance of critical and heterodox political economy currents throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And this is people, such as Keynes, Hobson, Lenin, Carr, lots of theorists, and especially, in the English-speaking world as well, but obviously many more outside of that narrow scholarship too. And it's really important whenever you're reading about histories of either international political economy or any kind of intellectual history, it's important to keep in mind that one of the effective ways of disciplining a discipline and saying, what does it include, what does it exclude, is to control the historical narrative that lays out the nature and origin of a field of study. And IP is no different. So Benjamin Cohen's intervention here into the history of IPE validates a very classical division of IPE into what's called American and British schools. And that represents kind of the core question in IPE as the relation between economics and political science, while also marginalizing a lot of strands of critical IPE. Generally, it's American school, and this is probably even, I'd say, the common way of teaching international political economy here as well, is the American school is a very orthodox, positivistic approach to IP. So there's very much, realist scholars, even, liberal scholars, and they look at the world in a lens, with their theoretical glasses on, that they account for things that they can see, and it's very based on quantitative measurements. Whereas the British school is a more critical school, and it has theories that kind of encompass Marxist kind of analysis, some different forms of feminism, some radical school of thoughts. But the original aim of what was, or what is now regarded as the British school, was to provide a distinct form of critique that contained some kind of normative commitments. And this was derived mainly from the work of a very famous theorist called Robert Cox, and he's someone we'll touch on in quite a bit of detail soon. And the emphasis on critical theory for the British school and for the British school as of today still, is geared towards understanding social orders as historically fashioned constructs that transform over time. And in this way, Cox, Susan Strange, other theorists of the British school were calling for a form of analysis that was geared towards interpreting and changing the world, borrowing a little bit from Marx's idea there. So what has now been defined as the British school didn't really emerge from a really inclusive engagement with all different kind of strands of political economy, but mainly from Robert Cox's classical distinction between problem-solving theory and critical theory. So problem-solving theory is the more American school, where they're often concerned about solving problems which affect international states, which affects the United States in the world. They're trying to solve problems and find solutions, usually through positivistic quantitative methodologies. Whereas critical theory is actually criticizing or, thinking, well, should these structures that we're trying to problem solve exist, or, will they exist forever and ever? And we'll now kind of talk a little bit more as to what critical theory entails. Ooh. Um, so critical theory problematizes socioeconomic and political structures like as a general statement. It considers them importantly like transitory, so they're subject to change, compared to like solving theorists who assume that these structures are they're going to persist. So whilst critical theory has appeared in many different forms, such as in the British school, what kind of unifies it is this progressive commitment towards like emancipation and the belief that the present social system can be transformed in order to address its injustices. So again, another quote from Robert Cox, a very famous scholar in critical theory and IPE. He wrote that critical theory does not take institutions and social and power relations for granted, but calls them into question by concerning itself with their origins and whether they might be in the process of changing. So his very famous critique then follows from that, which is theory is always for someone and for some purpose. So again, Cox is a famous scholar of the British school, but this like broader category of critical theory also encompasses some strands of scholarship that aren't encompassed by the British school. And we'll touch on some of these, and especially the more radical types of feminism that we'll explore in this lecture. So instead of Cohen's creation of IP in the 60s and 70s, or the birth of it, it might be better to think of that time period as more of a rebirth of IPE. There was obviously political economy before then, except it might have received such prominence in certain parts of the Western-speaking world. But it's better to think of the 1960s and 70s as being a rebirth of IP, where there was, we can see with retrospect now, like a greater kind of spirit of intellectual openness and engagement with different schools. And around this particular time, there was kind of three paradigms that formed. Firstly, liberalism, which many of you may be familiar with from other classes, and it is something we'll come back to. Mercantilism, which is kind of a renewed form of mercantilism. We spoke about it. It was obviously a school of thought a very long time ago as well. And then the third school of thought, which is more of Marxist currents, and that was sometimes inappropriately referred to as structuralism. And these three completed like an early trinity of early IPE. Now, after the 70s or so, and in the late 60s towards the 70s, Marxist and then neo-Gramscian theory really spearheaded the growth of really vigorous critical scholarship alongside the broader development of international political economy. And then during the 1980s, that kind of helped lead the path towards like constructivist, postmodernist, feminist approaches gaining popularity. And while that concurrently was happening, Marxism and neo-Gramscian approaches became increasingly marginalized, and especially in the USA, as academic freedom and so-called leftist thought was cracked down upon. Then, because of real changes in the world that we'll be talking about in some detail in this course, in the early 1990s, the return of like imperialism and empire as categories of debate, and especially after the Bush administration's war on terror. And then again, rebirth in the global financial crisis, the strength of critical theory have really become widely recognized again, and are really like pulling forward the IPE field. So critical theory is simultaneously concerned with not only the demystification of power, but also the development of alternative frameworks to expand, human potentials and possibilities is the broad idea. So critical perspective on the global political economy must go beyond what Marx once called the ruthless criticism of all that exists. And just to quote, I really like this letter from Marx that I'll read to you. So Marx wrote this in 1843 to, I can't remember actually exactly who it was, but he said that not only has a state of general anarchy set in among the reformers, so he's talking about liberals here, but everyone will have to admit to himself that he has no exact idea what the future ought to be. On the other hand, it is precisely the advantage of the new trend that we do not dogmatically anticipate the world, but only want to find the new world through criticism of the old one. Hitherto, or until now, philosophers have had the solution of all riddles lying in their writing desks, and the stupid, esoteric world had only to open its mouth for the roast pigeons of absolute knowledge to fly into it. Now philosophy has become mundane, and the most striking proof of this is that philosophical consciousness itself has been drawn into the torment of the struggle, not only externally, but also internally. But if constructing the future and settling everything for all times are not our affair, it is all the more clear that we have to accomplish at present. I'm referring to ruthless criticism of all that exists, ruthless both in the sense of not being afraid of the results it arrives at, and in the sense of being just as little afraid of conflict with the powers that be. So critical theory is about expanding this idea. Again, like I kind of hinted at before, even though there's some influence of Marx in a lot of these schools of thought, and even realist philosophy and liberal philosophy too, the critical theory is often trying to broaden Marx's perception of the social totality in various ways. So let's have a look at some of the ways that those critical theories have sought to expand these ideas and how they've developed through international political economy. So we'll start with Antonio Gramsci. So his original ideas we would call like Gramscian ideas, and then the more modern post 1970s is like neo-Gramscian thought. So I'll talk a little bit more about what these terms mean and who Antonio was. So Antonio Gramsci was born in the late 1800s and died in 1937. He was an Italian Marxist activist and also a theorist, most of whose work was written in really miserable conditions as he was locked in a fascist prison under the dictator Mussolini in Italy. He was originally quite a fairly orthodox Leninist, but his work became increasingly imaginative and wide-ranging. And his work was encapsulated, but what was called the prison notebooks, which were smuggled out of that fascist prison while he was writing there. Now, his expanding view of the world outside of a Leninist position, which was very popular in socialist currents at that particular stage, partly reflected the specific conditions in Italy, which it was a country that was not a highly developed capitalist economy, but it did have a highly developed political culture. And Gramsci recognized divisions between, like in Italy, between North and South, the diversity of oppositional groups, such as, very strong anarchist groups, which was, probably as strong as the very strong Communist Party in Italy. And then also the strong ties that both like conservative and opposition groups had outside Italy, which meant that Orthodox Marxism had to be critiqued before it could be applied into that particular context. So Gramsci's work wasn't translated into like English, French, or German until the 1950s. So it was only really received in the English-speaking world, just after World War II. And so his work then played a really crucial role in development of what was previously called a distinctive Western Marxism in the 1960s. So not a Marxism associated with the Soviet Union, which had like a non-Soviet Marxist understanding of society, culture, economy, and international relations. So it's more, kind of a more broader type of Marxism. And we'll maybe speak a little bit about what like a Soviet idea of the world entailed when we look at the Soviet Union's fall in a subsequent week. So his thought was largely influential in the emergence of an academic field that came to be called cultural studies in universities in Europe and North America. His ideas, maybe not in quite a way that he would have accepted, and we can't get into this in too much detail because of how much the limits to our time that we have, but his ideas did influence as well the work of the Frankfurt School, who are a group of very important theorists as well. A lot, especially with their leader Herbert Marcuse. And also Gramsci's thought was very influential in the formation of like a counterculture in the US in the 1960s and 70s. Whereas for IPE, the Gramscian approach has been a really important research area in the last 20 years and has continued to be a very fruitful way of approaching the explanation of the field since the global financial crisis. Now, Gramsci's kind of like sociology of power, or how Gramsci understands power to work in society, is very much based on Machiavelli's distinctions between rule by force and rule by consensus. So in Gramsci, this distinction characterizes two kind of ideal type aspects of supremacy. On the one hand, if supremacy is exercised without the conscious consent of the ruled, it becomes domination, right? So that like total force can just be domination. On the other hand, when supremacy is characterized with and by like intellectual and moral leadership, it's like an ethical hegemony. And in reality, there's not a really complete overlap between the Machiavellian distinction and the Gramsci one, as although, consensus always characterizes hegemony, rule by force is not always exactly the same as domination. So when consensus is obtained through like fraud and deception, hegemony is not ethical and it's not really hegemony at all. And on the contrary, it's then considered a form of domination. So Gramsci kind of notes that in the real world, power is often exercised using a mixture between force and consensus, which makes it very difficult to distinguish between domination and hegemony. So, for instance, if Gramsci was like looking at our society, for example, he might say, well, the rulers of our social totality and the politicians and the capitalist class and so forth, there is a lot of consensus operating. We get up and go to our work to earn money and make commodities, not because there's a policeman at our door who's like forcing us to do that, but it's consensual. Like we want to go get money. Like maybe we have ideas of we're doing something good in our work and it's something of self-fulfillment, or there's all these kind of ideas around us going and being a part of the status quo. And a lot of that is consensus, which as Gramsci explains, is built up by like ideology, by beliefs, by attitudes, these kind of non-material and non-like direct force reasons. But he'd also look at our society and say like consensus is operating very strongly, but there's also a huge iron fist which is behind that. I don't think I really need to tell any of you, but obviously the police and the army of modern countries far dwarf what Gramsci was used to, for example, in his time. And even though they might not be deployed in their full force, and very rarely are they ever, there's always that possibility. And so that's kind of like the hidden iron fist, which has some kind of domination behind the consensual aspects of hegemony. So Gramsci is kind of like situated between like a Marxist problematic of social transformation, um, and and also these kind of broader ideas of like hegemony and ideas and the other non-material things that Marx only kind of touched on but didn't go into in too much detail. Now, Gramsci's work, when it got translated to the English-speaking world, helped engender a really crucial break with mainstream international relations approaches, which is through this work of Robert Cox, who I mentioned before, as continuing Gramsci's work. And in contrast to like mainstream routes to hegemony and IR, which kind of developed a very statist-based theory of politics, which had this kind of ahistorical conception of the state and an appeal to like universal validity. With Gramsci's intervention through Robert Cox, debate kind of shifted towards a critical theory of hegemony, world order and historical change. So rather than a problem-solving preoccupation with the maintenance of, social power relationships, often, by states, a critical theory of hegemony directs attention to questions and also questioning the prevailing order of the world. And so the critical theory that Gramsci and Cox introduced into international political economy was one that developed what we call a dialectical theory of history, concerned with not just the past, but with the continual process of historical change and with exploring the potential for alternative focuses of development. So I'll go into this in a bit more detail quite soon, but Cox's critical theory of hegemony thus focuses on interaction with, between particular processes, which sprung from the dialectical possibilities of change within spheres of production and the exploitative character of social relations. So when we talk about, there's many ways of talking about dialectics, and I may mention it before, but when I'm using dialectics, it means that social relationships between like employer and employee, for instance, they're not just one way. They're going back and forth, and they're always in flux, and there's always possibilities for change. So dialectics and looking at things in a dialectical manner just sees basically relationships, that ontology of relationships informing our social world, but also how that can change. It's not fixed. Those who have power over someone else doesn't necessarily have to be the case forever. So it's just about bringing in historical framework at a very simple level into analysis. So again, conventional theory in international political economy up to this point reduced hegemony to like a single dimension based on the economic and military capabilities of states. So, and you'd see this even now, people will look at states like, the United States, for instance, and say like, oh, there's the GDP, the economy is this much. They've got, these many military bases. This constitutes their world hegemony. Whereas a neo-Gramscian perspective, which was developed by Cox, broadens this domain. So it appears as an expression of broadly based consent, which is manifested in the acceptance of ideas and supported by material resources and institutions, which is initially established by social forces occupying a leading role within a state, but then projected outwards on a world scale. So you can think about this, in terms of the acceptance of ideas and beliefs around the world. Think about like the dominance of the American media and Hollywood and movies and culture is very influenced by America across the world, and that helps with this kind of hegemonic project as Gramsci would describe. So these kind of ideas have been projected on a world scale. So let's just pop to our next slide where we go into a little bit more about Cox's ideas around world order. So within a world order, a situation of hegemony may prevail based on a coherent conjunction or like a fit between a configuration of material power, the prevalent collective image of a world order, which includes like norms and attitudes and values, and a set of institutions which administer that order with a certain semblance of universality. And thinking of institutions too, think of like, an institution we'll talk more about, things like, the World Bank, the IMF, even the United Nations. All of these institutions maintain a certain status quo. So hegemony is therefore a form of dominance, but it refers more to a consensual order, so that dominance by a powerful state may be a necessary but not a sufficient condition of hegemony. Now, hegemony within like a historical structure is constituted on three spheres of activity, which I've noted here. And I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'm indicating to the more top right diagram here. So you can see there's the hegemony within a historical structure is constituted by the social relations of production, and I'll talk about these in a little bit more detail soon. But this kind of encompasses the totality of social relations in material, institutional, and discursive forms that create particular social forces, for example. And then secondly, another triangle, corner of our triangle, the forms of the state, which consists of like historically contingent state and civil society complexes. So this is not just like the state, as a political entity governed by politicians, for example. It's also the civil society that kind of forms a shield around it. So that might be like NGOs, the intellectuals, and other kind of bodies and institutions, which even though they might sometimes seem like in opposition of the state, they still maintain the state's hegemony and the state as the status quo. And finally, world order is our next point of that triangle there, which not only represents the phases of stability and conflict, but also permits scope for thinking about how alternative, forms of world order might emerge. So within each of these kind of three spheres, and this is all like Cox's work, which I believe we'll be able to see in one of our, well, there's a few Cox readings this week, they'll be in one of them. And within each of these three main spheres of like social relations of production, forms of the state, and world orders, there's also these three other points within each one. So it's not just, so like, ideas, material capabilities, and institutions are also within each triangle. So ideas are kind of understood here as intersubjective meanings and collective images of what the world should look like. Material capabilities, oh, excuse me, material capabilities refers to, actually accumulated resources to make that, world order happen. And institutions, which are like kind of combinations of these two elements and a means of stabilizing a particular order. So within each of these three main points, social relations of production, forms of the state, and world orders, there's also, ideas, the material capabilities and institutions maintaining each of them. So the idea here is the arrows going back and forth is demonstrating that, if you have certain social relations of production, that helps engender or create a form of a state, and that form of the state then also helps concretize and strengthen that social relations of production that formed it. And then that those different forms of state emerging then create a certain world order, which is also based on a relations of production. So these things interact together to stabilize each other. And then, for instance, within, let's look forms of the state, for example, there's an idea about what a state should look like. There's institutions that uphold that idea of a state. And there's also the state has material capabilities like a police force. It's got an army. It's got, money. So these things interact to keep that form of the state present. So this is kind of a summary of how to interact together, but I'll go into a little bit more detail about these three main points here. So starting with the social relations of production, and we've already mentioned this a little bit, but I just want to recap it. But production here in like Gramsci's and Cox's sense is understood in a much broader way. It's not confined just to the production of physical goods that are used or consumed. It also covers the production and reproduction of knowledge and of the social relations, morals, and institutions that are prerequisites to the production of physical goods. So the objective of like outlining different modes of social relations of production is to question what promotes the emergence of particular modes and what might explain the way in each modes combine or undergo transformation. So it's kind of argue that the reciprocal relationship between production and power is crucial here. And so to examine this relationship, we can develop a framework that focuses on how power in social relations of production may give rise to certain social forces, how these social forces may become the bases of power in the forms of the state, and then how might these shape world order. So if you think about, for instance, like the relations of production, if obviously making, commodities in a capitalist relations of production, and then that also requires like, a skilled workforce. It requires like knowledge production to fine tune and technologically develop, for instance. And then that achieves a certain mode of production, which, we've seen, for instance, different modes of production emerge, like, financialization, for instance, which then engenders new power structures with like financiers and, banks becoming very powerful, which then changes the form of the state as well and influences the world order. So, and this, we'll talk about this a little bit more when we start to see these changes in relations of production over the course of the 20th century, which is very interesting. Now, going on to the forms of the state, changes in the social relations of production can give rise to new configuration of social forces, as we mentioned, and state power rests on these configurations of, social forces. So rather than taking the state as a given or a pre-constituted institutional category, that's just a thing that exists, consideration is instead given to like the historical, construction of the various forms of the state and the social context of political struggle that has seen it emerge. So this is achieved by like neo-Gramscian thinkers by drawing upon the concept of what's called a historical block, and by widening a theory of the state to include relations within civil society. So a historical block refers to the way in which like leading social forces within a specific, national context establish a relationship over contending social forces. It's more than just like a political alliance where, allies agree to work together, between these social forces, which might be represented by classes, for example, but it indicates the integration of a variety of different class interests that are propagated throughout society, which brings about not only like a union of economic and political aims, but also like intellectual and moral unity on like a universal plane. So this, I mean, you could make a lot of arguments for lots of different times where these certain historical blocks have emerged, but very much, when we spoke about the change from a feudalistic economy to a capitalist one, it was the rising bourgeois, who were like a historical bloc that was constituted not just by the bourgeois class, but also through other subclasses, lots of other relations in society who supported their emerging dominance, and then after that, you had theorists who actually created the ideas that gave a legitimacy to the bourgeois project, like liberalism, for example. So by considering like different forms of state, it then becomes possible to analyze the social basis of the state and to conceive of the historical content of different states. Um, and this notion of a historical block aids this endeavor by directing attention to like which social forces may have been crucial in the formation of a historical block or a particular state at any particular time, what contradictions may be contained within a historical block upon which a former state is founded, and then what potential might exist for the formation of a rival historical block that may then transform that particular form of state. So again, it's all about, change. It's about things being able to move in history. Things are not just settled. Even though the discourse and the ideology is that, yes, they are. Now, on world order, once hegemony has been consolidated domestically in a nation state, it may then expand beyond a particular social order to move outwards on a world scale and insert itself throughout the world. And by doing so, it can connect social forces across different countries. And so a world hegemony, you can think of it as it's like the beginnings of an outward expansion of an internal national hegemony established by a social class. And this outward, I guess, push of power is also linked to a social modes of production and the interests of a leading class on a world scale that can be supported by also international organizations. And this is what Gramsci referred to as the internal and international organizational relations of the state. So these might be things like, voluntary associations, organizations like the Rotary Club, like churches, for example, anyone that had like an international character, not particularly rooted within a state. So these are, a bit of an overview of neo-Gramscian ideas, and you can see that they're very powerful and that they have a totally different look to, the social totality compared to Marxism, and then obviously, the more mainstream theories of IPE as well. Now let's move on to them. I'm conscious of time. Kind of get carried away with these, but let's move on to feminist IPE. And like I mentioned at the start, there's lots of different ways of doing feminist theory. And so I'm going to be focusing on a particular strand of critical feminist international political economy, and kind of the strand that I use a lot in my own work. And we've kind of seen that, like, so far, conventional political economy analysis is focused quite firmly on like the productive economy. So this is, the study of how, where, why goods and services are produced, marketed, distributed, and consumed. Now, for critical IP scholars, one of the most important stories in relation to the productive economy pertains to like how and why notions of the productive economy are functioning on the basis of, so-called free markets. How did they emerge? A feminist IPE tries to, does successfully play a role here in demonstrating how the rise of this like market capitalist economy can't be viewed in a process whereby the market came to be what we call like progressively disembedded. And disembedded is a term by a famous theorist called Polanyi, who I think we have a reading of him later in the semester, but it's basically discussing how in the mid-20th century, the economy got disembedded from the politics in a sense, where there was, they weren't embedded together and they could be separated, not just like analytically, but also practically in terms of like, the state function. So what feminist IP does is demonstrate how the productive economy is shown to function so that forms of social inequality are reproduced within the capitalist productive economy and may be actually like integral to its functioning. So this rests on two important assumptions, often with critical feminist IPE, that markets benefit from the existence of unequal gendered social relations that associate women's labor with the social like reproductive realm of the household. And two, that the functioning of the productive economy also depends on the existence of other forms of division and inequality, such as race, class, nationality, that intersects with gendered social relations. So I will talk a little bit more about what I mean by social reproduction, but it's not like the like biological reproduction we might think about, but production we spoke about is like the making of the commodities. Reproduction is about, firstly, on a micro scale, the reproduction of people to be able to like get up the next day and be a productive member of society. And also the reproduction of communities. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that entails soon. So a lot of materialist feminist literature points to the centrality of the social reproductive economy in understanding like the broader dynamics of the global political economy. And it also goes to like, a lot of mainstream global political economies focus on the state level. Realist liberals, they're looking at the states as big functional units and what's happening at the state level in this kind of abstract realm of politics. Whereas feminist IPE, very importantly, points to the significance of the everyday, processes and caring activities that are so central to the functioning of capitalist economies. If anyone's familiar, I think there was a Finnish, I'm pretty sure it was in Finland, but like a widespread feminist movement in Finland a number of years ago, where women refused to do social reproductive work, whether that's like care, labor, emotional support, obviously also like biological reproductive labor, and refused to do those things, and basically the economy came to a total standstill. So the power of socially reproductive economy, even though it's often hidden, is one that's been emphasized by feminist scholars. So a feminist political economy often privileges an ontology of uh, relations, and where there's material interconnections between subjects and other subjects, and also the objects that they use in everyday life. Again, quite similar to a Marxist ontology. But the epistemological standpoint here is one that prefers the feminist standpoint. So looking at that perspective of the working woman, for example. So how and from whose perspective we view relations and social relations is really crucial. So by taking a epistemological feminist standpoint, which privileges women's interaction with the world, whether it's like through social relations with each other or with men, reproductive labor, so-called productive labor, culture, and other aspects. This is put themselves firmly in the place of women to analyze these, which feminist theorists say gives them a different perspective on the broader global totality. So importantly too, like often, women as a category, they're not homogenized here. A lot of feminist theorists don't homogenize women as one whole category. And instead, feminist political economy seeks to uncover like social relations that may constitute individuals and groups, such as women. And it does this by refusing to take distance from the subject. So it's not like a abstract objective approach is like a fly on the wall. They're very close to the subject of analysis. So women are said to be grounded within a materiality of the social totality by being so involved in the very crucial everyday reproductive labor. And by doing this reproductive labor, this determines their role as like caregivers in this social totality, which then you can see changes from the everyday level all the way up to the national through theories of what we call theories of social reproduction. And the core of a lot of feminist political economy is this social reproduction theory. And one of the readings that I had this week is by Tithi Bhattacharya, who is a really excellent theorist of social reproduction. And so she's defined social reproduction theory as an approach that is not content to accept what seems like, a visible finished entity, like, a worker just arrives at the gates of their workplace, but interrogates the complex network of social processes and human relations that produces the conditions of existence for that to happen. So, like, how does the worker get to the front gate of their work? Like, think about all the care work that actually got them there. So social reproductive theory brings in Marx's kind of critical potential, but broadens the perspective into the investigation of how, like, gender, racial, and other oppressions are co-produced in simultaneously with the production of surplus value. So Bhattacharya's concept of social reproductive theory is taken as like a baseline to be broadened further still. And we can focus like on women's conditions of existence and on social processes and relations that define them. So one of the things that other international political economy theorists have done in the feminist tradition have said that, well, let's look at social reproduction theory, think about it from the perspective of like the individual worker, how it reproduces them, but also broaden that, like, how does social reproduction work also reproduce the existence not of the individual, but for the community, but for the state, and then the broader capitalist system. So, like, reproducing the worker for continued commodity production, which is predicated on women's labor, then relies on and also reinforces capitalist social relations, ideas and institutions. So we have an idea, we must go to work, from 9 to 5 each day or whatever it might be, we must make commodities, and all that is socialized through everyday social reproduction labor. So, human subjects must be reproduced within conditions that sustain like shared meanings, certain dispositions and horizons of value that underpin social cooperation. So people like want to go and do work and cooperate at work and so on and so forth. And so social reproduction looks at in the biological, the economic, and the ideological sense, where there's a condition of possibility for the reproduction of the worker, sustained capital accumulation, and also capitalist institutions. So it's not just like a biological aspect. It's been greatly expanded by feminist theories. And a really great book which deals, and a very like classic one that deals with social reproduction theory and dialectical thought is the 1983 book by Angela Davies, whose name is escaping me at the moment. I think it's called like Sex, Class, and Race, I think, or something like that. But Angela Davies' book she wrote in 1983 is really excellent, which is like an analysis of housework as a sustaining factor for the entire capitalist mode of production, which subjugates women within a totality of both the exploitation of women's productive work, as workers, but also the appropriation of their reproductive labor. So, although like reproductive labor, as we mentioned before, and this comes out in Davis's work as well, it's vital for just the continued function of productive labor in an economistic sense. It's also really important to fashion people with the right attitudes, dispositions, who can be called on to even sacrifice themselves for the nation in times of war, or at least tolerate exploitation on a day-to-day level. So again, think of children being socialized throughout their upbringing. Often that's the work of women in their household, and they fashion them to certain social norms, which are quite often and typically in congruence with broader capitalist notions. So this ideological like propagation is also very central to social reproduction. Social reproduction, even though it does have the seeds of through analysis, understanding capitalism more broadly, and even being able to think about transitions and progression and movement, it still carries very much the seeds of repression that makes capitalism itself possible from the view of critical IP feminist scholars. And finally, another point, which I won't spend a huge amount of time on, but feminist scholars have started to come to engage with, there's a famous scholar called Rowan Connell, who has written quite a lot of work on hegemonic masculinity, and feminist intellectual political economy scholars have engaged in that to understand, well, how do neoliberal practices center around like deeply masculinized ideas of rationality and competitiveness. So like hegemonic neoliberal discourses focus on, often as theorists would say, a construction of a hegemonically masculine norm that depends on the construction of other groups as either like, hyper masculinized savages, who can't be controlled, or subhumans, for example, or backward feminized pre-modern actors who like need the patriarchal help, for example. Um, so these kind of discourse justify everyday violence and sometimes extreme violence, of war, and even of neoliberal development. So gender is not just understood by these scholars as something that maps easily onto certain, male or female bodies. And it's not something that's just added on as a concern, but something really integral to understanding the neoliberal economy more broadly. So these are, some points of feminist IPE. Obviously, it's certainly not exhaustive, but just a little bit of an example. And I think hopefully the Bhattacharya reading will also give you some ideas around how to apply social reproduction theory too. Now let's go to our last critical theory we're going to look at for today. And this is almost like an even broader group of theories than feminist IPE was before. But this is post-structuralism. So post-structuralism has been quite, a maligned school, I guess, in IP, and often hasn't seen as a very central part of international political economy. But they do offer a lot of really crucial questions that are integral to the field of IP generally. And they often query practices and processes of cultural representation, discourses, and also like political dissent and political structures. So post-structuralism, and I'll talk a little bit more about what it involves, but it's incredibly broad and kind of hard to pin down in a way. But it has something very important to say about the global political economy. And it helps us, the broad idea is it should help us interrogate the basis of like power, knowledge, representation, and identity. So these are very, it can offer us very important tools. But it's very classically understood as a very underused approach in international political economy. But it gives or offers methods of analysis, and hopefully you'll see this in the, I think it's the DGOID reading this week, methods of analysis that kind of seek to question the ways in which knowledge and practice are historically conditioned and informed by patterns of power, values, interests, and identities in the global political economy. So it's about like, and this is something I spoke about in my tutorials with my class, but like why there's spheres of, knowledge, for example, or hyper specializations in like academia or medicine or law or any other fields of knowledge, as, specializations which are siloed off from each other. And then what does that say about power? Like how does power operate through those siloed forms of knowledge? And then how does it impact our ability to deal with like broader global issues? And the post-structural critique more broadly is also particularly significant because it challenges us to kind of explore differently, various forms of insight into different aspects of global politics, especially like discursive, language, linguistic areas, which we might not normally see with other IPE methods. Now, I can't, get into this too much, and it's certainly not my area of expertise, but post-structuralism is seen to be derived from a break in linguistic theory, which I certainly don't know too much about, but a break between what was like called structuralism in linguistic theory, and then it's kind of come into its own in international political economy as a quite highly contested concept that rests somewhere between there's kind of these how do you say, like, originating French philosophers which are really important for post-structuralism in general, and then a lot of international political economy thought has built on some of their ideas. So like I apologize if I brutalize the names, but Deleuze, Derrida, Foucault, for instance, have been really crucial scholars for the post-structuralism. And I've also included a Foucault reading, which looks like Foucault's idea of biopolitics, which has been a very powerful way of understanding the global political economy, in your recommended readings. And so, there's these very complex ideas where post-structuralism is constituted by, this trinity of French philosophers and those who have followed in their path. And there's another kind of idea that post-structuralism can also be reduced. It can't really be reduced to like other theories where there's some kind of shared assumptions, there's a shared method or a theory, but it's so differently constituted that it's like a movement of thought. It's like a complex series of different ideas that embody different forms of critical practice and is influenced in its different trajectories through the appropriation of a whole different range of sources. Like, it's a very difficult theory to kind of pin down. And so it's been difficult, and often, in international political economy histories, post-structuralism hasn't always like found a place in histories of IPE, for example. And this idea of trying to demarcate post-structural interventions in IPE has been quite difficult. It's I think the de Goade reading will help you a little bit more with this, because, like I said, it's not my area of expertise, but the post-structuralism kind of, building on those French theorist ideas, it becomes like an interpretive analytic that invites us to kind of, reconsider and even destabilize conceptual categories of IPE that we use today, like, the state, the firm, the financial district, the economic actor, capitalism as a whole, and gets you to like really well question, like, what's the power behind these forms of language? Like, what's the power behind these symbols, behind these forms of knowing and doing? So it's kind of maybe not as materialistic focused as like Marxist critiques, but still has a bit of that idea of critiquing power. Now, as some examples which I'm a little bit more familiar with, and these aren't always regarded as like postmodern authors per se, but they do some postmodern work. There's a very good text by Noam Chomsky that many of you may have been familiar with, called Manufacturing Consent. And even though Noam Chomsky is kind of more of a radical liberal, that book, Manufacturing Consent, does lean into what we might consider as a post-structuralist analysis. So he kind of looks at the way in which like the media, in conjunction often with like government press offices, can frame certain issues to suit certain political agendas, which is very much an interest of post-structuralism. This might be by excluding the reporting of some issues altogether, or using language to create a particular tone or attitude towards the facts that are subsequently presented. And you can, Chomsky's analysis here is still very much an important and relevant topic today. So this kind of strays a little bit into the field of something called discourse analysis, but it is a fundamental aspect of the post-structuralist approach. So it's about that interpretation, and any kind of post-structuralist approach that uses interpretation, it also has to engage with how language projects a particular meaning, and what this meaning has in the global political economy, and the aspects of power that's associated with. So, in the post 9/11 world, anything that has the word like terror associated with it then has gained a really deeper meaning. You can look at national legislation that has been brought in the name of counterterrorism in a lot of states, which has then enhanced police power. And also certain political power of many political groups as well. So then the definition of who might be constructed as a terrorist, or might constitute activities that bring new police powers into play has expanded significantly. And then this goes towards, again, the construction of these terms and what they mean in the social totality. So it's really important to highlight the power relationships behind these particular issues that other fields of international political economy don't quite like see. And finally, another author I just wanted to note here, and this is Susan Strange, I mentioned as being one of the leading theorists of the British school. And again, I think it's probably not, yeah, probably not at all fair to call her a post-structuralist theorist, but there are, I guess, post-structural ideas and ideas around power that are dealt with in, her work. So yeah, she wouldn't normally be pigeonholed as like a post-structuralist writer, but again, yes, some parts of her work, like she has a very famous book called States and Markets, which was written in 1994. And in it, she describes like four key structures as like constituting the political, global political economy. There's like security, finance, production, and knowledge. So knowledge is where, she deploys some post-structuralist analysis. So this includes like the advantage of being more advanced in research and development in all aspects of society for like science, military, economic, or other competitive endeavors. And it also can refer to this knowledge as Professor Strange used it, to consider what is actually even known or what's true, right? So constituting what is knowledge and what isn't is also a way of wielding power. So relating again to those post-structuralist ideas of, understanding or meaning. And Strange develops this particular point with reference to how like power relationships are developed, enforced, and maintained. And in the context of international political economy, this can be in terms of the way in which like ideas of like progress or development are understood and promoted. So, ideas of like how countries should develop then create certain power structures and gives power to certain people who have like the knowledge of that development, which are always generally Western reformers, right? So, these ideas around what progress or development is might seem self-evident in their meaning, but on closer inspection, they're profoundly subjective and subject to manipulation, subject to, power behind them as well. So it's really important to consider this. And I think this is the power of the post-structuralist critique. It kind of breaks down our assumptions and, what we felt was true around the use of terms. And it helps us analyze in a bit more of a granular, not always material level, how the use of like discourse and language and terms can really shape our global political economy and our own ideas as well. So I think this is probably all we have time for. This is just, again, a brief introduction to some critical theories of IPE. This week, we're going to be going into our tutorials and trying to apply some of these theories, hopefully through some, good activities that everyone will enjoy. But yeah, on behalf of the team, we look forward to seeing you there. So thank you very much.